I can hear sawing. It sounds like sawing.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, welcome everyone to our positive behavioral supports series that we've been fortunate enough to be funded from the, not only from the state of Kansas for their All In Kids Quality Subgrant, but we're also supported in part by the University of Kansas Medical Center and their Cigna grant in the Department of Pediatrics and their ECHO series. And so upon entry, you probably were muted. Kari, a question for you. Do you want to entertain questions throughout your presentation, or would you like folks to hold it till the end?
I am entirely fine with people asking questions, so people can feel free to hold them till the end or drop them in the chat, or if they want to, there's a couple of spots where I'm going to encourage them to, think and answer questions. So they are welcome to chime in when they would like to.
All right, perfect. So until then, if you could stay muted so that we can minimize distractions, that would be great. If possible, please keep your camera on because that helps to create an engaged learning community for our gracious presenter, Kari Wold. And that way, if you have any questions, you can ask and we can see and we can have a back and forth conversation. I'm pretty sure everybody's fluent with Zoom by now. However, if you're not, you can see at the little bottom, there's that chat function. If you have a question and you want to drop it in there. And then finally, while this particular series is not currently set up for BACB, Behavior Analyst Certification Board CEs, we can certainly offer you a certificate of completion, right? So you can get a certificate if you want. If you do that, if you want a certificate, make sure that your name is listed so that we can verify that you are in the meeting or the presentation for the entire time. And we will make sure to get you a certificate of completion after the end. Next slide, please. So here's a little bit of our agenda. That our introductions will be for the first 5 minutes or so. Then we will have a didactic presentation from our gracious presenter, Kari Wold, followed by a group discussion, which we will then have follow-ups or suggestions. Now, throughout the presentation, you might see on your right-hand side this little symbol that says level up. When you see that sign, we're very interested in hearing how you've encountered some of this information in your personal work, in your personal life. We also, or how you've used some of the strategies maybe that the presenter is going to be talking about, how this topic has impacted your professional or your personal life. So we're interested in hearing that from you. Next. And then also, because we are grant funded and we are responsible to let our funders know how we're using their money, there will be just a little bit of an assessment. And it is not only to be able to report to our funders, but also to be able to improve our training and be able to present topics that are of interest to our community, whether you're a parent, or a professional, service provider, whoever, we're interested in getting that feedback. And then finally, after the training, you'll get a survey. Please, 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 after the last session of this PBS series, make sure you fill that out so that we can have the information to be able to help continue offering this as a resource for families and members of our community. I think Kari would like to say that she would like to mitigate any potential bias by fully disclosing that the information that she's presenting is based on evidence that's currently accepted within the profession and is not deemed to be clinical advice. It's just information presented on best practices in our field currently. And so now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker, Kari Wold. She is an LMLP and she works at Integrated Behavioral Technologies as the clinical supervisor. So she oversees all the clinical staff. Kari has worked at IBT for well over 6 years and came to us as an intern, I believe. Is that correct, Allie? And decided that we were worth investing her time, energy, and resources in, and decided to stay on in a place of employment with the company once she became, got her degree and became an LMLP. Kari has graciously agreed over the last like 3 years, maybe 4 years. She has presented on suicide awareness and preparedness in an online class that I teach for behavioral assessment at the University of Central Missouri. So she's presented to pre-service students as well as presenting in the community at large. So we're really fortunate to be able to have Kari come in and talk about suicide awareness and preparedness, especially as it relates to positive behavioral supports, right? And how to be able to view an individual within that PBS framework, which is like, I'm not going to go into it anymore because otherwise I'd start talking about it and I would steal some of Kari's thunder, which I don't want to do. So at this point, I'm going to quit talking and I'm going to turn this over to Kari. Kari, I'm really looking forward to hearing the presentation today.
Awesome. Thanks, Linda. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. As Linda mentioned, I'm Kari, and I will be speaking with you about just overall suicide awareness and preparedness. We'll talk in depth about a number of things. And so there's objectives on the screen, but we're going to talk a little bit about facts and statistics in regards to suicide, both in relation to adults and children and adolescents. I want to speak a little bit with you about learning some of the risk factors and red flags and warning signs, as that is a huge step in helping provide a protective factor for other individuals around us. I'm going to speak a little bit about the different tiers in regards to understanding what tier someone may fall in, depending on maybe what warning signs or red flags you're seeing. And then some steps to take to try to keep someone in a tier 1. And again, we'll talk a little bit about those tiers so that that makes more sense as we go. So as I mentioned, feel free to ask questions. There will also be a time at the end to ask questions and drop them in the chat. If someone would watch chat for me, that would be awesome. So in regards to the tiers, there are three levels when we look at PBS, so positive behavioral supports. Tier 1, so that primary prevention, is really where we aim to stay. And so tier 1 focuses on looking at the whole population. So if I'm looking at, let's say, the school setting, I'm going to provide something to the student body at large. So this could look like something as mental health first aid. And so everybody's going to get this teaching. So mental health first aid, just to give you a little background, is teaching about various disorders, trauma, psychosis, substance use, a number of things. It also talks about recovery and resiliency, and also brings hope. So, you know, even when you experience this, so it normalizes mental health related issues, things can get better. And so the tier 1, that primary prevention, would provide this to everyone. Whereas the secondary prevention is going to be a little bit more targeted. So this is when you find someone who's at high risk, or maybe multiple someone's who's at high risk, and maybe that particular subgroup gets one-on-one intervention with the school counselor. So it's a little bit more individualized based on them being identified as a high-risk individual. And then you have that tertiary, which is specialized and very individualized. So this could be something like someone who is very high risk, perhaps is needing hospitalization or very intensive services. And this could happen as a means to reduce the chance of possible mortality or worsening of symptoms, or worsening the, or increasing, I should say, the likelihood of having long-standing severe mental health issues. So as we go, you might hear me refer to tiers. And so our goal is to stay in the primary tier. But when an individual is in that secondary and tertiary tier, it's okay. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means when that happens.
So Kari has a level, go back a minute, Kari.
Yeah.
She's got a level up here. So can you think of a program or intervention that might qualify as a tier 1 primary intervention? Feel free to just go ahead and drop that in the chat.
And Linda, thank you. My video with everybody on it was covering that, so I appreciate it. Perfect. So again, feel free to drop it in the chat. I'm going to continue, but we'll check that out after a bit. So I want to explain a little bit about some of the terms you're going to hear me use, just because I think it's important, because there is a lot of terminology regarding suicide. So suicide itself is defined as a death caused by a self-directed injurious behavior with the intent to die, and it actually causes death. Whereas a suicide attempt is an engagement in self-injurious behavior, but does not result in a successful completion of death. And so at times, suicide attempt may cause injury. At other times, there may be no injury involved with that attempt. Whereas suicidal ideation is that thinking or considering or planning a suicide or suicide attempt. Now, I did not put it on here, but there are times where people have fleeting thoughts about, it would be easier if I was not here. And then they immediately recognize, well, of course it would be, because you're not here, and it ceases and they go on. And I would not so much say that's ideation. And so I wanted to really make sure to lay out what the field looks at as far as that terminology and how it defines each of those things as we go through. So just some basic facts to share with you all. So according to the CDC, suicide is the second leading cause of death in individuals ages 10 to 34, and the fourth leading cause of death in individuals aged 35 to 44. Now, there are certainly statistics for individuals 45 and up, but I wanted to kind of target this younger population today. There is some research, and unfortunately, we know there are cases of individuals under the age of 10 who have completed successfully a suicide attempt, and so they have committed a suicide. However, the research is pretty minimal for a number of reasons, and so I more found the information consistently for that 10 to 35 and 10 up group. In regards to the total number of suicides, in 2019, 47,000 people roughly successfully completed a suicide. So that's roughly 130 suicides per day that occurred. Although 1.38 million attempted. And this is concerning for me for a number of reasons. So not just because of a lack of a loss of human life, but also because you have clearly a large number of individuals who are struggling, maybe don't know what resources they have. Perhaps they don't think they can reach out, or they don't know things can get better. And so that's very concerning for me, that we have such a large number of people that have attempted or even contemplated. The highest rates were among females aged 45 to 64 and males 75 years of age and older. And males completed suicide at a higher rate than females. And so my level up here is, why do you think there is a difference between genders? Why do you think we see that difference? Check chat. Yes, so Molly wrote, the means they choose are more deadly: impulsive decision-making. Aaron Powell, okay, stigma. Great, so yes, so part of the reason why when we look at research, men complete at a higher rate is because they choose a more lethal means. So it tends to be guns, which is an immediate cause an immediate response and result. Although women actually attempt 2 times the frequency, so they're twice as likely to attempt. They tend to choose means that are less deadly and less immediate, which is why we do see that variation. Okay. So in regards to children and adolescents, so in 2019, for every 100,000 people, so individuals aged 10 to 14 were 2 to 5 deaths of that 100,000. Now, when I say 2 to 5, that is because 2 of those deaths were female and 3.3 were male. Whereas that 15 to 24 age range, 5 to 27 deaths were within that 100,000. And 5 of those deaths were female to 22 males. And so again, males had a higher rate of completed suicide for both of the age groups. Now, each day in the US, there's an average of 3,700 attempts for individuals who are in high school, so that 9 to 12 grade range. And again, this is highly concerning to me because this is a time where these individuals are growing and learning and being exposed to a number of things, and perhaps they don't know that, you know, things can be better. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, things can improve. And so giving them tools and access to tools to help them see those things is going to be very important, which is part of what we're going to talk about as we go a little bit on further. But one thing to be aware of is that individuals who complete or attempt, out of those folks, 4 of the 5 actually give some sort of indication of their intention. So whether this is verbally or behaviorally. Now, that said, some of these things are very straightforward and very easy to catch. So, you know, they might say something like, you know, when I'm gone, whereas some are more subtle. So maybe they are giving away things small, a little bits at a time, or they are slowly starting to isolate themselves. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of those red flags, because that is, again, a big first step in being aware that there might be something that's happening that you want to intervene with, or perhaps you need to intervene with. Does anybody have any questions so far?
There's no questions, but there was a chat from Molly, I believe it was. Yes, that said her daughter's teacher has a positive affirmation. She has her 2nd grade class day at the start of each day.
Perfect. And we'll actually talk about affirmation. So Molly, I'm glad you brought that up, and we'll talk about that too as being one of the protective factors.
Yeah, so looking at it in terms of that tier 1, you know, that's a great way to have a tier 1 strategy in place that might mitigate the risk.
Exactly. So I'm glad you brought that up, and I'm excited to hear that people are doing that. And so we will certainly talk a little bit more about that too. So awesome example. So knowing the risk factors. So there are a number of risk factors, and these are certainly not all of them, but I want to talk a little bit about some of them. So the first of which is having a history of a psychological disorder. So some of the higher risk disorders might be depression because of that the bipolar disorder family, because of some of the mania and the depression that occurs. The mania has some impulse control related problems that arise that may contribute to, you know, if somebody is feeling down and then that impulse control is low at the same time, that is very scary, as well as drug and alcohol use. Feelings of distress, irritability, and agitation, long-term feelings such as these can really start to weigh on a person, as well as hopelessness and worthlessness. You often see those come hand in hand with depression. A previous attempt at suicide. Now, this one for me as a clinician is very scary because in the sense of, if someone has previously attempted, not only have they been clearly in a place where they got to the point where they attempted, but they also in some ways have become desensitized to that action. So one of the things that we will see and that we have seen is, let's say an individual's plan is involving hanging themselves. Well, if they get used to putting a noose over their neck and pulling, and that's just what they're practicing, they have in some ways desensitized themselves to that action. And sometimes that action is what scares people out of doing it. And so to me, having a previous attempt is a very scary thing, and something that is, for me, is important for me to be aware of when I'm working with an individual, is if you've had an attempt, what does that look like? Any history of emotional or physical or sexual abuse. These are very traumatic experiences and can be very long lasting. A family history of depression and suicide. When we look at genetics, we know that certain disorders, if a family member, especially a parent, is diagnosed with that disorder, the likelihood of the child having it does increase. Lack of social support. So if they're isolated on top of already maybe isolating themselves, that can be problematic. Struggling with gender identity. So when they're going through a time in their life where things are already hard and hormonal and all the things, and then to be, struggling with who you are, whether you're in a community that just doesn't view things like you do, or perhaps it's very harsh, that can be a very traumatic thing and can really exacerbate some of the issues and some of those red flags. And then finally, life changes. So families going through divorce or parental separation, financial changes, military deployments, these are all risk factors. Now, that said, individuals can have these risk factors and not ever attempt. So I don't want people to think that just because there's a risk factor means that their child's immediately at risk. But knowing the risk factors is very important. And being mindful of those, because as we talk about some of those warning signs and you seeing the pairing, it's important to be aware of those things so that you know when it's time to seek out assistance. So warning signs, talking about death and suicide in general. Now, before I go on, I want to talk a little bit about this because it is not unusual for children to be curious about death. Okay, so depending on what your family beliefs are, whether you talk about religion or, heaven or hell or Hades or God or angels. A lot of children, because they can't see it, are curious. They're like, how do we get there? When can we go? Who's going to be there? What's it like? They're very curious creatures, right? They're wanting to know things. And so having conversations and being comfortable having them is really important. You don't want to shame them for asking. You could have these conversations, and perhaps after the first questions, they're done asking and they move on. Perhaps they're asking questions and you start to have concerns. It's okay to reach out to somebody who maybe has a background in working with these types of things and asking for assistance, because if you're not sure, or it's causing your parent, feelers to go off and I don't know what's going on with my kiddo, it's okay to reach out for help. Giving hints that they might not be around. So making comments like, well, when I'm gone, or, things will be easier when I'm not here anymore. Talking about feeling helpless or guilty. I'm always in the way. I'm not a good enough person. It's never going to get better. Beginning to isolate, writing songs or poems or letters about death. Now, this again, I've seen this with adolescents, and this isn't entirely uncommon. But if you find that your child's written something, it's okay just to ask and say, hey, I came across this. What did it mean to you when you wrote it? What were you thinking? Like, what did that mean to you to write that out? And have a dialogue, right? Part of this is having these very caring and open conversations to increase that communication and decrease the risk. Loss of desire for things, struggling to concentrate, so they just really can't, they cannot focus. If their eating habits or sleeping habits change. So if you have a teenager who's starting to sleep even more than they had, or perhaps they're not sleeping anymore and they're really sleeping minimally, perhaps they've stopped eating. And then loss of interest in school or sports activities. So if they were a kiddo that was really engaged in activities and all of a sudden they just have stopped putting a lot of effort and care into their work. Those are all important things to be aware of and to be watchful for. When these signs are seen, someone may be in a state of mind that does require more intensive intervention. They may have left that tier 1, and they may need something. And that is okay at that point, and at any point really, to seek assistance to keep them safe. Because in all the long term, we want to keep them safe. That is our goal. So actions to decrease the risk. So this is going to go into kind of what Molly mentioned, which I'm excited to talk a little bit about. So these things are not a guarantee that they are going to entirely eliminate risk. And I would never promise that, but these are things that you can do to stay within that tier 1. So the first of which is playing an active role in building up your child's mental health. So positive affirmations, teaching your child to speak kindly to themselves. So this could be anything from I am kind, I am smart, I am beautiful, but I would even take it further and do affirmations that are not based on condition. So I am perfect because I am me. I am wonderful because I am here. We base so much in our world on conditions that if that condition is gone, that could be detrimental to them. So having a wide variety of positive affirmations and teaching them to speak kindly to themselves is so key. Normalizing emotion. So often, you hear things, and when I see kids and they, and they're experiencing something, my first thought is, and I ask them is, are you a robot? And they go, well, no. Okay, well, you're correct. You are not a robot. You're a human, and humans are supposed to feel. And so part of this is normalizing emotion. So if your child is very sad, hey, that makes me sad too. I'm really sorry you feel like that. Let's talk about ways, or let's do some things that might make you feel better. Right. And so you not only just normalize the emotion, you express that you have felt it yourself, and then teaching ways to work through it. You could do this with all emotions. So, when they're mad, hey, buddy, I know you're mad. I can tell why you're mad. I would be angry too. Give them the language. There's different levels. So frustrated, mad, furious. Teach them that emotion is normal, and teach them how to get back to a state that they're comfortable in. So whether that's a neutral or happy state. Establishing healthy social media. So I want to talk about this a little bit in technology use. There is so much exposure to social media and technology, and there's a lot of great things that can come out of it, but there's also a lot of problematic usage, which is the overusage. And in my opinion, this can really cause a skewed sense of normal. It can cause a skewed sense of what's normal body, what's a normal life, what's a preferred life. And when you're talking about individuals who are aging and maturing and their brains are developing, their brains may not quite be in a place that they can digest what they're taking in a way that is healthy. And so I do have some concern with that. There is also some current evidence that suggests that excessive or problematic use, that overusage, does impact suicide risk. And so specifically increasing those risks of suicide attempts. However, they really need longitudinal studies to look at establishing the direction of potential association. So, if we're looking at sleep interference or social cyberbullying, some of those things, and then recommendations on what's an appropriate usage. But that's going to take time. And so I'm not at all saying, we should take all social media and we should take all electronics, but setting that healthy boundary of, hey, let's do this and then this, and part of that's building it in, but really establishing healthy use of those tools, and so that you can, again, provide some protection there. And then making yourself available to your child and knowing or learning how to have caring conversations. So I'm so glad you told me that you feel like this. I don't want you to go through this alone. Let's work through this together. So often people need to hear that they were heard. And that in and of itself is very impactful. And so having that ability to have those conversations is key. And sometimes it takes a lot of practice and learning to actually be comfortable doing them.
Kari,
sorry. Yeah.
So sorry to interrupt your flow, because you've got this really nice flow going here, but if for those of us on the call who are in childcare facilities, how could we incorporate some of this into a child care center?
It's a great question. So there's a number of things that I think of. So when I think of like childcare, and I think of some of the things that you can do to kind of mitigate the risk, the positive affirmations is one of the first ones, because teaching people to speak kindly to themselves is huge. And so often it doesn't come naturally because our negative self-talk tends to kind of sometimes override everything else. So number one, teaching positive affirmations. Molly, as she mentioned earlier, talked about, the positive affirmations they do at the beginning of the day. That is an awesome way, not only to start the day, but an awesome thing to be teaching. You can also do some things in class that practice and emphasize emotion. So whether that's through role play, pretend play, whether that is doing some sort of craft project that deals with whether it's teaching an emotion or possibly some sort of social story type of thing. Depending on the age group, you could even do some sort of play, where they get to act out something and you encourage them to, be super furious like the Hulk. And then somebody comes in and teaches them how to do these skills. And there's a number of things I can think of that you could use across that environment to really work to integrate that into that setting.
I think that's great. And then the bullet point that that I interrupted that you didn't get to, like when a more intensive intervention is needed, it's okay, right? So maybe also teaching the kids how to be able to ask for help when needed and honoring those requests.
Exactly. And one thing I think, Linda, that sometimes, and unfortunately, a lot of culture has come to this idea that when a child does this or a person does this, it's attention seeking. Do not jump to it's attention seeking. It's not that it couldn't be, but sometimes the attention seeking does cover something that's very deep underlying that we do need to address. And if it's something that is attention seeking, then we teach them, how do you express and get attention a way that is healthy and a way that's not going to be long-term concerning, right? So there's so many things I think that childcare facilities and people that work with young people could really use across community and classroom and even in the home to really reduce some of these risks.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, so what parents and caregivers should do. So the thing is, as I mentioned earlier, it is not always preventable, but knowing those warning signs and taking them seriously is a great first step. So watching for the warning signs, knowing the risk factors, and just being attentive. Those are things that are really going to be important to be a protective factor. Now, asking questions, but not shaming. I will tell you, this is probably one of the hardest things that I hear from not only parents, but also some clinicians. I mean, this is okay, but asking questions, it is hard, but it does open the floodgates. And so, as I mentioned on here, it talks about things like, hey, I've noticed you've been talking a lot about when I'm gone. Have you been having thoughts about killing yourself? So often parents and caregivers and even some clinicians, especially green clinicians who are new and they're learning, have this fear that if I ask, I'm going to cause it to happen. If your child or someone you know has been actively thinking about it, you are not going to cause that because they have already been thinking it. And so by asking honestly, a lot of times, that is showing that you have cared enough to listen and you care enough about them to listen and ask. And sometimes that in and of itself can protect them. And so being comfortable asking is important. And if you're not comfortable, that is okay. There are plenty of us that are, and that's when you seek out those of us who can assist to provide some feedback and to provide some supports so that we can get your child the help that they need, perhaps, but it is okay if you're not quite comfortable doing that. But again, having that conversation demonstrates so much more than just the outward words, right? It shows that caring and compassion that so often these people feel that no one does care, or perhaps they're burdened. So being mindful of that. If your person, so whether it's your child or someone you care for, is experiencing some great distress or you have serious concern, get help. It is okay that they have left the primary intervention and perhaps they need something more intensive. So you could call your local emergency room, call 911, take them to the emergency room, or even call the National Suicide Hotline and ask for assistance or guidance on what you should do next. I provided a link that talks a little bit about suicide prevention through NIMH, which is the National Institute of Mental Health. But those are things that are entirely appropriate to do if you are at a point that you're either past your comfort level or you're at a point that you have serious concern that I can't keep my person safe. And it's okay to say that because there are times where we can't keep them safe in their home. And when we get to that point, then we do what we need to do to keep them safe. So I provided a couple of crisis and suicide hotlines in Kansas just for information for everybody. I'm happy to share them later. I just pulled some from each of the areas. Most often, if you search, crisis intervention in my county, and you type in your county, it will give you individuals or organizations, community mental health centers who provide crisis intervention. So whether it's a 24/7 line, whether they redirect you to 911, there are plenty of resources across the region and in Kansas and then outside of Kansas that are prepared and equipped to help handle and work with some of the things that occur in regards to mental health and suicide.
Kari, so at what, I don't remember, what is the prevalence of suicide risk or ideation in kids that are like 5 to 12?
That's a good question. So that was really hard for me to find. And it's not that it's not out there, but there is a lot of, I'm going to say, inconsistency in data. And
Right.
it's because if you think of like ideation and kids' cognitive reasoning and understanding, and sometimes even their verbal and how they explain things, it sometimes is really hard to parse apart, what are we looking at, right? Is this a ideation? Is just this a curiosity? And so there certainly needs to be, in my opinion, more emphasis on that research because we have clearly seen suicides in individuals under the age of 10. There just is not a lot of consistent research, whereas, like the CDC, for instance, can give you a lot of data from 10 plus, but anything under, it's very, very, very quiet.
Because I've had some kids before that, and that they get really mad and they're like, I'm just going to kill myself. Mm-hmm. And so, it's hard to determine whether or not they're actually really saying they're going to kill themselves or whether or not they're just really mad and frustrated and they don't have the words to be able to express that correctly.
Yep. And yeah. And so sometimes, the feelings, and Linda, you touched on it exactly. The feeling is so big that the only thing that they have to express it is death, because death is permanent. And in kids' understanding of permanency, depending on the child, varies. But sometimes, and I've heard that too, and again, as a clinician, I'll talk with kids on ways to express it differently, is, if the feeling that, let's say they're so mad that that's where they go to, well, then a lot of times what I'll do is I'll start teaching them different levels of anger and frustration. So we have frustration, anger, and I'm just going to name 4: frustration, annoyance, anger, furious, and the 5th, livid. And so we go through these and we teach them to try to match those. And then a lot of times I'll pair them with pictures. I'll have them create things like picture boards. So, hey, when you're mad, what does it look like? And they find things like, a lot of times it's superheroes that match that, versus when they're furious, which is like Hulk, here is where I am. And there's a number of things that we can do to help them identify visually what they're experiencing. And then we start giving them words. And so there are certainly times, and Linda, that is part of, I think, the issue is it's so hard to tell, is this ideation? Is this a child who is just simply echoing something they've heard and they're so angry that that's all they can come up with? Has that behavior been reinforced, and perhaps they're saying it because of, there's a number of things. And
so my follow-up question then would be like, for those of us that are parents or grandparents or childcare providers, if we have, and we're trying to implement strategies to prevent kids from getting to that top of that pyramid, right? Would this, like, how would this look like as a tier 1 intervention, and what would it look like as a tier 2 intervention?
Yeah, so let's say for tier 1, I'm going to use the childcare. So let's say you have a pre-K class. So your tier 1, when I'm thinking of this, and just kind of off the cusp, you're going to teach everyone something in relation to expressing emotion. So perhaps you're doing activities, right, that teach appropriate ways to verbally express emotion. So whether that's words, whatever that looks like. So everyone gets it. Let's say tier 2 is that you have identified 4 kiddos who go from 0 to 100 like that, and they just are not responding to that tier 1. Perhaps they have some sort of pullout with the 4 of them, that they're getting something that's a little bit more individualized. Now, what that would look like, we think would vary on the center, whatever the state and board governed rules are, what they're permitted to do. They would have that pullout time to where it's individualized to that group. So they've left the everyone gets it, and they're now getting this more targeted treatment. Does that make sense, Linda?
It does. And, I just think that sometimes as early childhood educators, and I've gotten called into different centers, not just the IBT or the kids place, right? But for kids that are failing, right, for one reason or another. And I just think it often comes down to emotional regulation. And I'm just wondering, what's the trajectory for these kids, where if I have this little itty bitty and they're having a hard time, they have a hard time with emotional regulation, they have a lot of risk factors in their life. It's like, how can we set this up? And what recommendations can we make to folks, like how to include some of these strategies, like these social emotional curricula in early learning centers. So we're teaching kids how to identify their emotions. We're teaching them how to express them in a really positive way. How do we teach these self-affirmation statements? And then how do we teach them that it's okay to say, I need some help right now because I'm really mad, for a little guy, right?
Yes.
And how we can support that as these kids transition from the little itty bitties in pre-K into, the school age classroom. And
yeah.
So
and that's where, as the field, so not even just the mental health field, but I mean the field of us as adults, that's where we have to really start, I think, and it's not that we haven't been doing it, but we need to advocate for what we know would be helpful. So the things, everything you mentioned, right? Like, these are all incredibly important things and tools that should be emphasized, because again, we see research, we see what society is, what they have access to, and we have to counter that. And so I think part of that is going to be actively working to incorporate these things in. So whether that's when I think of like childcare models or early education, whether that is actively seeking these things out and advocating for the importance of these things to increase the likelihood that they'll use them as they age. So many, every child and every person comes from a different background and a different home life. And so we cannot assume that every child is getting the same exposure and the same teaching at home as far as how to communicate. And so if we are in a setting that they're in their little fishbowl and they're with their peers and they can practice these things and they can be exposed to adults who can provide them this, hopefully this warm structure, even if we're giving it to them at some, small level in their whole world, that's better than nothing. And so part of that is us actively advocating for our little people, of what we know that will be helpful. So communication, teaching positive self-talk, because we know what happens when people are overly critical of themselves and when they constantly are berating themselves. We see what it does to their well-being. We see it come out in, feelings of depression and other things that occur. And so we need to start it young, and we need to be the voice for them.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking, like for some of the little itty bitties, like doing puppet shows, right?
And that's actually a great idea. You can have puppets, and you have a puppet where your puppet hits the other puppet and the puppet's sad, and then a third puppet comes in and, why are you crying, and validating the feelings. There's so many things that you could do, especially through play and with these littles, and right. And so sometimes you're like, oh, it's just play. So much occurs in play, and you can teach so much in play. And these children are sponges, and they soak it up. And so do these things intentionally, as when you're in the classroom, or even if your kid is a little bit older, do things, mental health first aid, figure out how do we get this in the school? How do we teach this to everybody to normalize it? So if maybe they didn't get that in early education or childcare, teaching them that emotion is normal, it can improve. How do you teach resiliency? How do you teach positive self-talk? How do you override cognitive distortions, which is one of the things I work with my clients on? There are so many things that we can do. Part of it is getting people the tools, making them available, and giving people the insight that those things are there for them.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And the last page I have is just national hotlines I wanted to share. So there's an LGBTQ+ hotline. There are now chat lines, so through text that you can use. Then the kind of the old school but standing National Suicide Prevention Line and Suicide Hotline. So these are all things that you can use. Let's see if there's something in the chat. Yeah, so yes, so practicing those skills while the children are in the overall good mood. So Erin, you made up a really good point. So one thing that when I think of teaching skills in general with children, and really any skill, is you want to do this when they are in a calm or neutral state. So when a child is horribly escalated, the last thing you want to do is try to teach a brand new skill that could be frustrating to learn, and they're already irritated. Whereas if they're learning to practice deep breathing, and there's some really cool ways to teach deep breathing to children, for instance, to help them come back down so they're not escalated, they're going to be able to practice in that calm state. And as they practice and they do it repeatedly in that calm state, the chance of them implementing it while they're in that escalated state increases drastically and dramatically. But teaching them that in that calm state, among other things, and in a good mood is really important. So very good point, Erin. So that is all I have for you all, but now I would like to open the floor for any additional questions or thoughts.
I'd like to hear from people. We did hear from Molly about and Alice about psychological first aid as a maybe a tier 1. I'd be interested to hear what other people have used that could be considered a tier 1 that could be implemented just in our everyday interactions with kids to be able to help produce resilience, or maybe some programs that you guys have used with kids that would maybe be considered a tier 2. Let's share the wealth.
And feel free to speak or unmute yourself, or if you want to drop them in the chat, I have chat up and I'm happy to read them out if you come up with some.
I think probably the easiest sort of tier 1 approach would be to, ABA is all about specific positive phrasing and all that, but it's real easy for individuals to get, fall back into the trap of non-specific praise or non-specific compliments. And so when you're interacting with the kids, being as specific as possible about the things that you're praising them for or complimenting them on, and knowing as much as you can, when you're in a classroom with a kid, you tend to get to know them all fairly well. And so if you know they're particularly self-conscious about a skill, making sure to target that skill as one that you go out of your way to, praise and give compliments to.
Awesome. Great example, Erin. And I like that. I like that specific, right? So not just a good job, but hey, I liked how you did blank. Molly put a note in here. She said she learned a great practice introduced and created by Mel Robbins called the high five habit, which is simply giving yourself a high five in the mirror in the morning. So I appreciate her sharing that. She had to hop off early. Anybody else?
Well, no, but I do want to say it, like, think about extrapolating that high five.
Mm-hmm.
Think about it like if you're in the classroom, if you're in an early childhood setting, or even in a classroom, that if you started the day off or the session off or the after school session or whatever it is with, you come in and you're like, all right, everybody, we're going to give ourselves high fives today, and get the kids to give themselves a high five. They would think it was silly, right? And they may think it's fun, but it's something like, hey, I'm going to high five myself because, just because they're a little human being, right?
I'm awesome because I'm me.
Yeah, I'm
And
awesome because I'm me.
And I'm sure some of you have probably seen this, but if you have not, I suggest you look it up. There are a lot of classrooms now, and I love it, that are incorporating something at the beginning of the day. And there's usually, they'll take like a poster board, and there's a couple options. So a high five option, a hug option, a silly dance option, and something else, right? The teacher holds it up and the child can touch whichever one they are comfortable using, right? So they express non-verbally which thing they want. So whether that's a high five, something that's going to elicit something positive, right? But it's based on that child. Every child gets to do it when they go into the classroom. And I've watched videos of these, and I think not only is it adorable, but it's awesome because you can see these children light up. And at times they'll have a peer, and the peers rotate through the weeks, help the teacher hold up, and they get to do it to their peer. And so if the peer is holding it, then if the kid wants to high five their peer, they high five their peer. If they want to hug their peer, the peer can hug the peer. And so then they're also doing it with each other. And so they're not only getting to do it with their adult, but they're doing it with the person and the people that they're with even more frequently, which is those peers.
I think that's a great idea. What's the name of that program?
I don't know, but if you just, I can send Linda, I can send you something, and I can send something in-house, but basically more or less, it's just, again, usually I see it on a poster board. They have a couple different actions the kids can do, and it's basically like a welcome to the classroom kind of start of the day chart system, I guess. And I don't know what it's called, but whoever created it is genius because it's awesome. So
yeah, and what a cute, and that would be a tier 1 if you're looking at it in the peer PBS. That would be like a tier 1 strategy that you can use that's going to decrease the probability that kids are going to need tier 2.
Exactly.
And the fewer kids that we have in tier 2, the less likely those kids are to hit that tier 3, right? Especially when we're talking about something like suicide and suicidal ideation, because that's permanent, right? And thanks, John. It looks like John dropped a chat, a link in the chat, because the thing
smile is so powerful you can face anything. Invis is 10 million smiles strong. Invisalign.
Started before I went to do it too. But you guys should see me.
Não é sobre ter todas as pessoas do mundo pra ti. É sobre saber que em algum lugar alguém vai curtir.
So this is what I was referring to. So every classroom that I've seen it in is a little bit different, but it's a really cool thing that a lot of the classrooms I'm seeing now are implementing.
Yeah, what a wonderful, just like personalized introduction to every child that's walking through the door. And what a way, yeah,
And so often we cannot control what the home lives are like. And
yeah,
so those things, not only are you acknowledging and appreciating what they identify as important to them, but so many of those kids, if a hug is what they need to feel love, what did you just give them? You gave them so much in that, right? But those are all things that can create that feel good sense on top of it, which again, they're two conflicting emotions. You can't feel this and you can't feel the positive and the negative at the same time.
yeah.
And we work to increase the likelihood of frequency of positive feelings to try to reduce, again, some of those more negative feelings that often do come along with the suicide risk.
Yeah, and I come from a background where I did a lot of resiliency interventions with kids in the community court system in San Diego County.
Mhm.
And really what I found was, like, instead of looking at risk factors, if you look at the resiliency factors, the kids that are resilient are the ones that have an adult in their life that care about them. Doesn't have to be the parent, doesn't have to be the aunt or the grandma, or, but a school teacher, a preschool teacher, a friend, the neighbor, the garbage man, somebody that gives personalized recognition and has an invested interest in that individual. And so when you look at the program that you said, and we have another comment in here that says that they love that video, and there's several different ones like that as well.
Not give a high five without smiling.
Yeah, that that could be that person for that kid, and that could be the person that prevents them from trying to kill themselves. Just that personal interaction.
Yep. And so often, again, you can't ever guarantee, but there are certainly things that we can do to monitor, and there's certainly things that we can do to be watchful. But there are also things that we can engage in behaviorally to provide a protective barrier around people, not just little, but also just like-aged individuals. So,
yeah.
Any other questions?
Well, Kari, I'd certainly like to thank you for presenting on this today. I think it's a topic that we often don't talk about, right? Because it's uncomfortable to a lot of us when we talk about people that, it's hard enough when somebody dies or is, a victim of a violent crime, but when they actually take their own life, there's so much stigma that's still attached to it in our society that we often don't talk about it. So I think it's really important that we bring it out of the closet and talk about it. It's real. And what can we do as a community that is a helping community and an educating community? What are some of the things that we can do to help prevent that, right? And be able to help support. So it really is an important topic, and I appreciate having you here.
Of course, yeah, I know, and it really is. It's a topic that's important, and it's one that mental health and mental wellness have been longstanding, and so the only way that we're going to improve it is to have these conversations openly, and get comfortable having them, and showing the people around us that we care enough to have the conversations to try to help. So,
all right. Well, thank you all for coming.
yes, thank you everyone so much for coming today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kari. Great job.
Thank you.
Oh, it was so smooth.
Thanks.